Welcome everyone to this presentation. This is Aurora, Learning the Basics. We've got with us today Abba Shapiro, who is a fantastic instructor, and he's an evangelist for Skylum software as well as a co-director. So he's going to be sharing some of the basics of Aurora HDR 2019 and also show you some tips that hopefully a few of you folks will learn today. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this presentation. Abba, thank you so much for presenting today.
Well, thank you very much, Laurie. It's great to be here, and thank everybody for joining us. We're going to go over the basics of working with Aurora 2019. This was the version that we just released back in October, in early October, and completely redesigned our HDR engine, which was already an amazing engine, and it just has really taken the ability to get the detail and the full tonal contrast out of all of your images. This is the image that we show when you signed up for the webinar, and I'll be working with this. I just wanted to kind of introduce you to it. This is a before, and as a matter of fact, this was a JPEG image. I also do have the camera raw. And it was kind of a gloomy sunset in Shanghai. And then after bring it through Aurora, I was able to really bring out a lot of the detail and color and really make this sky pop. And this is the actual sky that was there, and I just really pushed the different colors. So we'll learn how to do this with both with a single image. We'll also be working with some bracketed images. And let me go ahead, and I'm going to hide this and talk a little bit about bracketed images and Aurora in general. So bracketed images, for those who don't already shoot that, is when you shoot multiple exposures at the same time. So for instance, I'm going to open up this folder with Brazil in it, and we will open that up. And let's just make this nice and big so you can see the images. And so here is some images from the falls in Brazil. And as you can see, the images were bracketed. So some images were underexposed, overexposed, and properly exposed. And generally, when you bracket your images, it's usually about 1 or 2 stops difference between them. So let's go ahead and launch Aurora. And we're going to import these images, and we'll talk a little bit about the process of what happens under the hood and some of the decisions that you can make when processing bracketed images as well as single images. We'll start with bracketed images first, of course. So I've launched Aurora, and this is the interface, and I can go ahead and I can choose Open Image. I just want to point out that there is also the ability to do batch processing. I could drag an entire folder of images on top of this icon or open it up through the batch processing. It will determine the groupings, and I can go ahead and automatically process a whole bunch of images at a single time. Let's go ahead and click on Open Image. I'm going to jump to my desktop, and I'm going to go ahead and choose this folder with Brazil and just choose these 5 images and go ahead and click Open. Now, Aurora will show me each of these images and will also show me the exposure value of each of the 5 images. Now, these were shot 1 stop apart. So that way I was able to, you can see you can capture the sky and the detail of the sky in the underexposed, and I can see the detail in the trees in the overexposed. So now I have some decisions to make at how I'm going to bring these together. So the first choice is this button here, or this little checkbox here, which is for auto alignment. So what this will do is this, if it was handheld or sometimes even on a tripod, there's a little motion, it will make sure that all the images are aligned with each other. So I always check this. Usually I shoot handheld when I'm doing bracketed. I try to shoot fast enough that I don't get any camera blur from motion. So we're going to go ahead and select that. And once I do auto alignment, I have some more choices underneath this cog. So as you can see here, the first one says ghost reduction. And what ghost reduction does is if there is movement within the image, cars moving, people walking, birds flying, perhaps even the flow of the water in this image, what it will do is I can choose which exposure I want to be the primary exposure, and it will remove the ghosting caused by movement within the image from the other frames. By default, it chooses the standard exposure. But if I wanted to, I could click here and say, I really like the motion of what's happening in this +1 or in the -1 exposure, but we'll leave this at the default. And then you can choose how aggressively you wanted to remove the ghosting. Once you do that, there's a couple of other choices. If you have a lot of dark areas and you don't really have the overexposed part, sometimes you'll get a lot of color noise in the shadows. And I can have Aurora fix that when it merges these images. I can also do denoising with both the luminance and the color once I'm inside the program. So this is a choice, and your mileage may vary depending on your images. I generally find that with darker images, I find this helps a lot. And finally, the last choice that you would have would be whether you want to remove chromatic aberration. And a lot of times when you have high contrast areas in an image, a lot of bright against dark areas, vertical lines, buildings against sky, if you look really closely when zooming in, you'll see a little bit of fringing along the vertical and horizontal edges. Sometimes you'll see purple and green fringing. And what chromatic aberration does is it compensates for that. It also compensates that in some lenses, as you get to the outer edges of the lens, especially on wide angle lenses, you also see some distortion depending on how that lens was built. So a lot of times we can click on that. Now, the more choices you select, the more math it's going to have to do under the hood, and it may take a little bit longer to open up. I'm not going to worry much about the chromatic aberration at this point. And also for color denoise, well, I am going to leave that on. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to hit Create HDR. And let me explain what Aurora is doing now under the hood. And this is new. This is our new HDR engine. Instead of just merging the images together and figuring out what's the bright and dark spots or the bright and dark areas, what Aurora does is it's analyzing each of the separate files. And these files can be raw files, as you saw here, from all the different camera manufacturers, NEF files, ARW files, the Canon files, CR2s, Fuji files. We work with all the standard RAW, but you can also use TIFF files as well as JPEG files, and it works really, really well. So what Aurora is doing, it's analyzing each of the images and finding the best exposed parts of each of those images and creating a mask just to use those parts of each individual exposure. And then it's going to blend the best exposure, having created the mask using artificial intelligence, into a single image that will really bring out the details in my highlights and be able to open up my shadows so I can actually start working with it. So in addition to doing the brightness on the dark areas, it's actually looking at the content. It recognizes through machine learning things like mountains and sky and foliage. And this is the image that it was able to draw out from these 5 images. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you what the before middle exposure image looked like. And I'm going to do this and walk you through the interface at the same time. So if you look in the upper center part of your screen, there's a button and it's the quick preview button. And if I click on this, this was the middle exposure. And as you see, the sky is a little bit washed out and I don't have a lot of detail in the foliage. And it also is a little bit muddy. Well, technically it is muddy in the water, but this is what Aurora was able to pull out by blending those 5 images together. So now I'm ready to start working and really creating the look and the image that I want. Now, there's 3 parts to the interface. We're looking at the main part, which is, of course, our image. At the bottom, we have something called looks. And what looks allow me to do is very quickly stylize my image or enhance my image. And looks are organized in collections. And I'm clicking on a little button right above those thumbnails where it says collections. And when you get Aurora and you download it, you will have a variety of looks pre-installed. And we have even more looks available for free on our website. You can create your own looks. And we also have had some folks create special looks for us that we sell through the website. And Laurie will show you how to access all of that at the end of the webinar. But what's really nice is our looks are broken down stylistically into the different types of fixes or enhancements you may want to perform on your image. So maybe you just want to go into the Essentials tab, and you can see here across the bottom, I have a variety of thumbnails, and the thumbnails represent exactly what's going to happen to the image when I click on any of these looks. So if I click on natural, and I want you to notice a couple of things that happen when I click on this. First of all, you'll see the image will change, but over on the right side of the interface is the filters area, the filters panel. And as I select a look, the filters will adjust to give me that look. And what's important is that none of our looks are locked in. It's not an on or off switch. It's a starting point. In some case, you might be happy with it and it's a finishing point, but you can think of it as getting you almost where you want to be. So let me go ahead and I'll click on natural. And you can see that the color was boosted a little bit, the foliage popped. So it kind of gave me kind of a natural enhanced look. But if I go through, I can click on each of these and step through them, either by clicking on them with my mouse, or I can just use the right and left arrow keys. Let me go ahead and bring that back again, and simply step through all the variations. So these are some presets that I can go with. I'm going to take a quick look at Deep and HDR. Well, I kind of do like what HDR has done for my image, but maybe it's not exactly what I want. So I want to show you how you can easily modify a look. So every look has a slider associated with it, and I can blend that look back with my original or my originally processed image. So if I felt that the HDR look was just too severe, I could scale that back, and maybe at this point, I'm done. Once again, I can look at the before and after, and you can see that's pretty dramatic. And what's amazing is it's pretty quick. Had I not been talking so much, I could have just brought this image in, clicked through some selections, dialed back the HDR look to, it looks to be about 76%, and simply export, and I'm done. And I've gone from this image, which is okay, to this image, which really pops. But let me go ahead and expand upon that. In addition to being able to dial back globally how this look affects the image, I'm going to bring it back to 100%. And we're going to move over to the right side of the interface and look at some of the filters and what has been done. And then afterwards, I'm actually going to start from scratch and work through the filters on a completely unprocessed image. But I do enjoy the fact that I can very easily stylize my image or process my image with a single click, and I don't have to spend hours post-processing, because what I really like to do is shoot pictures. And so the photography is the fun part. Yeah, I could spend 2 hours processing this, but if I can make it look exactly how I want in 10 minutes, that gives me more time to shoot or more time to be able to process other images. So as we go down through our filters, the first thing is your basic developing. And this is where you can deal with exposure, you can work with the highlights and shadows, whites and blacks. So I can start tweaking my image if I wanted to. So for instance, it automatically brought up my shadows when I hit the HDR Look 1 button. But if I thought that it opened them up too much, I could dial them back. So you can see each of these controls are infinitely adjustable. I do want to point out some of the really useful features within Aurora HDR that are unique to our software. One is the smart toning, and this is actually one of my favorite adjustments. What smart toning will do is if I move it to the right, it opens up my shadows but doesn't blow out my highlights, so it won't blow out my skies. So if I move this to the right, you can see it's opening up the trees and the ground a little bit too much there, but I'm showing you the extreme. But if you notice, the sky isn't getting blown out. If I move it to the left of 0, it's actually going to recover some of the luminance in my skies, but it's not crushing the shadows and I'm not losing that detail. So I really love this smart toning filter. It allows me to really get the feel that I had when the picture was shot. And it's very unique, and I play with this a lot, and I find it's a lot easier to work with than trying to tweak highlights, shadows, and whatnot. Another thing that I really like is the way we work with color. And you'll notice that under color, you have two choices. You have something called saturation and vibrance. And if you're new to photo processing, let me explain how saturation and vibrance works and why I love vibrance and I think saturation is the bad kid on the block. When you slide the saturation slider, it increases the saturation equally in all parts of the image. And the problem is, if something is already saturated, it becomes super saturated just so you can make the muted colors appear normal. So it's not very smart. It's very global. I'm going to double click on the little circle. And anytime you double click on a circle, it will reset back to the default. So let me go ahead, double click on that, reset that back to 0. And I want to talk about vibrance. Vibrance is smart saturation. So what it will do is if I move it to the right, if something is more muted, it will saturate it. But if it already is saturated, it won't add to that saturation. So it basically just saturates the muted parts. So it kind of equalizes everything. And again, if I move it to the left, it desaturates the more saturated areas before it hits the more muted areas. So the way I actually like to work with these two filters, and I'm going to hit this little counterclockwise arrow just to make sure this is reset back to its default, is I often bring the saturation down a little bit, and then I bring up my vibrance to compensate. So this kind of equalizes the saturation across the entire image. And sometimes adding a little color contrast. And what this works with the mid-color ranges. So I'm tweaking this image, even though I already liked it, but it's showing you some of my favorite features and some of the newer features in Aurora 2019. The other thing I want to point out, and I used one item here already, was this little counterclockwise arrow. That's the reset. And to the right of that, you'll see, again, another eyeball, similar to the eyeball that we saw earlier when I was able to show you the image before we processed it and the image as it is now. The eyeball next to an individual filter allows me to turn off just that filter and see exactly what's being done with the adjustments here. So it's very subtle. I can see it more in the histogram up top about what it's doing to the colors, but it's always nice to be able to see the effect of a unique filter and the before and after. I'm going to scroll down through some of the other features. We're not going to cover every filter. That would be a much, much longer webinar, but we do have all of these detailed in the user manual, and Laurie will show you at the end of the webinar, we have lots more video tutorials online that cover a lot of the nuances with these filters and some of the workflows. A new feature in Aurora 2019 is under the HDR Enhance filter, and clarity and microstructure were here, and I'll touch on those just briefly, but I really want to focus on smart structure because that's a new feature. So a lot of times, depending stylistically on what you want to do, you can really push the clarity of an image and make it pop. But a lot of times, HDR gets a bad name because sometimes it's too strong. It looks too artificial. So again, it's something that is stylistically what you're looking for when you shot the image. Microstructure, and when I work with a lot of these elements, I like to zoom into 100%. And so I'm zooming in, there we go, and I'm going to let it process. And to zoom into 100%, I can just click with my mouse, or I can go up to this little drop down. And now I can go ahead, and when I'm working with structure, I can really see what's happening. You can see if I pull the microstructure over to the right a little bit, you should be able to see it in the webinar, but this is definitely getting some extra sharpness, but really in the small details. So that's kind of nice. I'm going to bring this back. What Smart Structure does, and this is the new feature, is it is, again, analyzing the contents of your image and adding structure in the areas where structure should be added. So a lot of times you don't want structure added in your sky because that's going to make it kind of look too crunchy, but where you want the detail in these trees and on these rocks would be nice. So this is Smart Structure, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to move it to the default of 0. So this is what the neutral setting would be. And the reason it was moved to the right is when we applied HDR Look 1, that affected what all these sliders did. But we're going to take a look, and as I move that to the right, you can see the image is getting nice and crisp here, but I'm not getting over detailed in my sky. And that's really kind of a nice little thing. So I can go ahead and move that to the right. Once again, we look at the before. And so this is without our HDR enhance. And this is where we're starting to bring in a lot of that detail. So you can see that we are dramatically enhancing this image going through all these settings. If you recall at the beginning of the webinar, when I merged the 5 images together, I said I had the option of correcting noise before I brought it in and also after I brought it in. So here is where we can actually correct some of the denoising, softening some areas, and sometimes you do get some noise in the clouds. There's a lot of sensor dust here. We can fix that in another spot. But I could go ahead and I could bring in some of that denoising and bring that in. So I would go through, and as I go through, there's a lot of different filters, and what I would recommend is the best thing to do is if you want to get an idea of what a filter does, just play with it and bring it to the extremes, okay? Bring it all the way to the left and right with the sliders, and then you can also, once you've played with it, turn it off and on to see what that filter has done. That's the best way to really get your head wrapped around different areas. For instance, the polarizer will help with bringing out the blue in the skies, and a little bit goes a long way. That's a little bit too much. So I can go ahead and I can start working with a lot of these elements to stylize my image. A couple of other filters that I want to just focus on, and then we're going to actually talk a little bit about how I can just do what are called local adjustments to just part of an image, is I want to talk about one, our adjustable gradient, okay? And I just clicked on that to open it up. And what this allows me to do is change the exposure, and this is great for landscapes. Maybe I want to open up the sky or open up the foreground a little bit, darken the sky. So I can go to the top and say, okay, there's my exposure, bring it down, bring highlights, maybe cool it off a little bit. And the important thing is at the bottom is the set orientation. And when I do that, it allows me to position that gradient where I want it up and down. But in addition to that, if I go a little bit outside of that circle, I can rotate it. So a lot of times I'll use this not just for an even horizontal skyline, but sometimes even if I have an image where I want to work with something maybe to the left and to the right. So we're going to go ahead and cheat here. I think what I want to do is actually cause this foliage in the foreground is too bright. So instead of using this as a horizontal gradient, top and bottom, I can go ahead and now on the bottom, go ahead and bring down the exposure so my eye's not drawn to it. And I think I'm going to go ahead, bring down the vibrance so the color isn't drawn to it. So there we have with our filter, and there we have without our filter. And we're already getting to what I like. So I'm going to go ahead, bring my exposure back up to 0 by double clicking on that. And we are good to go. So let's take a look at our before. That was the neutral image out of the camera. This is our image after we've processed it a bit. And that really gives me something that I like and something that really pops. So instead of going through all of these, what I want to be able to do is show you how I can then do some what we call local adjustments. So maybe I have the image where I like it, but I want the clouds to be a little bit softer. I don't need them to be as crunchy, or I want to highlight some area or some colors here. I can do that by adding what's called an adjustment layer. And I get to an adjustment layer simply by clicking on this little plus sign at the very top of the layers area. And there we go, I can add a new adjustment layer. There is the option to add a new image layer. So if, for instance, I wanted to bring a second image and blend it in with this image, maybe I wanted to bring in different clouds, or I could also bring in a new original image layer, which is the original image that I brought in from my raw file. And sometimes I may want to blend that in without any processing. But for now, I just want to create what's called a new adjustment layer. And when I create a new adjustment layer, I can go ahead and I can apply another look to that, or I can go through and I can start doing detailed work or local adjustments to specific areas. And then what I'm going to do is paint in those adjustments where I want them. So for instance, I don't want my clouds to be as crunchy. I really want them to be a lot smoother. So I'm going to actually go down here and go to my details boost, my HDR details. And instead of moving it to the right to add detail, I'm going to actually move it over to the left. And I'm going to be pretty bold here. I'm just going to move a lot of these to the far left. And you'll notice that what it's done is it's really softened my picture. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to even be very aggressive and go up here to my denoise. I'm going to bring up the denoise, and I'm going to bring that microstructure down. So this looks horrible, doesn't it? That was my plan because I really care about the clouds, and I think I really did push this a little bit too far. Okay, that looks a little better. Now, once I've done this, I can go up to that same adjustment layer. There's the eyeball if I want to turn it on and off. So that's what I've done. I've softened my clouds. But next to that is a small paintbrush. And if I click on that small paintbrush, I can get a choice of 3 different ways I can create a mask to either bring in or delete the adjustments from this layer. So probably a gradient mask would be the fastest thing to do. So let me go ahead and I'll do a gradient mask here. And as soon as I click on that, the interface up here changes to the left a little bit. You see mask, you see an eyeball, and then you see a click and drag to draw a gradient. So I'm going to simply click and drag. And what you can see here is it is actually putting a gradient. So this is where my filter is being applied from my adjustment layer, and this is where it's very sharp. And I can grab the edge here and even soften the gradation between the crunchy part and the soft part. You'll notice in the upper left part of the interface, there's again another eyeball. These are really useful. This says show mask. And when I click on that, you'll see this red area. That's where everything from my adjustment layer that I just created is being applied. And where I don't see the red, it's left alone. So this is showing me exactly what's being affected. Let me go ahead and turn that off. So that's really kind of nice. And I was very quickly able to soften my sky without affecting any of the foreground. But I can also take advantage with adjustment layers of painting in detail or opening areas up. So maybe I want to work a little bit with this area here where I want to open up the shadows a little bit. I want this to be brighter. And I'm going to just create another adjustment layer. And on this adjustment layer, my eyes are only looking at this area here. And I'm going to use a little bit of that smart toning to open that up and add a little contrast. Here we go, and open up my shadows. And let's make it even crunchier, a little more clarity. So I don't like what it did to the rest of my image, but I like what it's done here. So I'm going to do the same thing. In this time, I'm going to click on the mask and I'm going to choose brush because I want you to see how that works. And now you'll see the interface in the upper left has changed. It's a little different than with the gradient mask, where I can choose to paint or erase in any of these local changes. And I can control the size of my brush, how soft it is, as well as the opacity. And a lot of times I do like to bring the opacity down to say 50%, because that way I can paint in gradually instead of very broad brush, pardon the pun. And I can also do a couple of other things. A lot of times I'll zoom in with my mouse so I have more control, but I can also make my brush larger and smaller with the left and right bracket keys on your keyboard. So that makes it bigger and smaller. And if I hold the shift key and left and right bracket keys, it will actually, you'll see there's an inner red ring. It's making my brush softer and harder. So if I don't want to go up here to these little drop downs, I can go down here. And now watch as I start to paint. As soon as I make the first stroke, you'll see that that sharpness will disappear from the rest of the image and will only affect the areas that I'm painting in. So now I can just start painting in areas where I really want things to be a little brighter and a little sharper. Let me make that brush a little bigger with my bracket key. And I want to point out that same little eyeball we have to show the mask. I can see exactly where I'm painting, so I know where I'm putting that extra detail. And I want the detail on the trees and the rocks, not on the falls, because I want that to be nice and smooth. If I overshoot, I can switch from paint to erase. by this little button here. Keyboard shortcut is X. And by the way, everything I'm showing you is both Mac and Windows. There is parity, so X will go back and forth between paint and erase, and the bracket keys work the exact same way. So there I have what I wanted to paint in. I basically brought out some detail here. Let me turn off my brush, and you can see it's subtle, but I'm starting to be able to do some nuanced changes. I'm going to go ahead and zoom back out to 100%. I'm sorry, to zoom back out to fit to screen. And once again, there's my before, and there's my after. Much more of the image that I want. Let me just show you a couple of final things with this bracketed image, and then I will show you how well it works in a single image, and then we'll take some questions. So I like this, but I want to change the cropping on it. And to change cropping, there's the universal image of a cropping tool. The C key is the keyboard shortcut to get there. And when I click on crop, it will automatically show me my boundaries. By default, it is locked to the aspect ratio of the original image, but I can choose to click on that little yellow lock button, and now I have full control of how I want my crop to work. And if I needed to do something other than free cropping, so for instance, maybe I had to deliver an 8:10, so I'll use the 5:4 aspect ratio. And now I can crop this, and this will be exactly what I would have for an 8:10 image. One of my other favorite ones is the ability, of course, to do square, because that's nice if you're putting out anything to say Instagram, and you can start again choosing that. Or if I want to put it out to Facebook, I never have to remember the aspect ratio of my cover page. I just go and I let Aurora choose that, a little bit of sky. I hit done. And there it is, properly cropped. Now, I do want to point out, this is completely non-destructive. And what's even more exciting is that it has unlimited undos. So I can do Control Z, Control Z on a PC or Command Z on a Mac, and I can step back one step at a time. But even better is to the right of that undo is my history dropdown. And when I click on that, I can actually scroll down and see every step that I have taken to build this image. It remembers everything from the very first original image I bring in. So I can see, oh, how did I do something, or what did I do? If I want to look at an adjustment, I can step back in time and forward in time to any point along my editing process. Now, if I jump to this point and I start making additional changes, everything above it will be erased, and we'll start with that as a new point. But this is really nice. But what's even better is I'm done with my image and I'm ready to save. And I'm going to save this two ways. I'm going to save this as a Aurora project file, and I'm going to save it just as an image to share. And the thing about saving something as an Aurora project file, I'm going to simply go to File, and I'm going to hit Save. We'll save it to my desktop. And what this will do is this is going to save my original resources inside of the project file. So it's going to save all 5 of those images, and it's going to also save that entire history. So when I reopen the project file, I will be able to step back to any point in time. And that's great. So if I'm not done working on an image, I can simply save it and pick it up the next day or the next week and keep going. Or if I want to go back and change something. Now, if you're working on a Windows machine, you'll need to click on Windows. On a Mac, you have a choice to click on Windows compatible. And all this does is it creates a file that is recognized by the Windows operating system that when you double click on it, it opens up. So it's completely cross-compatible. If I'm in Windows, I don't even have these choices because it automatically saves the history and the resources and can be opened up on a Macintosh. So that's one thing that's nice to know, is that when you acquire these applications, they work the same. Serial works on both Mac and PC. So if you're moving back and forth, you can do it smoothly. And the thing to keep in mind is if you're saving it on a Mac, you just have to make sure that Windows is able to open it, but that's easy. The other thing is these files don't have a lot of overhead. Now, you'll notice that this document size is 427 megabytes. The bulk of that are the 5 images that are being saved. If I go ahead, and I'm going to just might as well save this to my desktop, and let me hide the application for the moment. And you'll notice if I look at these images, these here alone are a little bit over 200 megabytes. So there's not a lot of overhead on this program. And that's what I really like about it, is that all these adjustments are just math, and you don't get these really bulky, huge file sizes. It's just pretty much the addition of your source files and a little bit of math on top of that. So there's that image. Let me go ahead. And if I wanted to save this as a file that I can share, I can get to that in 2 places. On the upper right corner is Share Image. I can also get that under File, and I can say Share To or Export. Okay, so Export is the same thing as going up to the Share menu here. And I'm going to export my image. And what I want to point out is that I can save this as a variety of formats. Not only can we read in all these formats, but I can save TIFF files, I can save JPEGs, PNGs, PDFs, .psds, so Photoshop documents. So in the case of each of these individual ones, so in the case of a TIFF file, I can save this as a 16-bit or an 8-bit file. And this is basically the color space for the color depth, I should say. So you don't have any banding in your sky. 16 bits is great for printing. And I can also choose my color space. And if I wanted to, I can also resize this. So I can keep its original size, or I can say, you know what, I just want this to be no longer than 3,000 megapixels, and it'll calculate the height. So it's very flexible in all of this. I'll keep this at its original. I can do some sharpening. I usually have done most of my sharpening within the application, but sometimes people like to put a little bit of sharpening on when they're going to put something out for the web. So as you can see, and I can also choose compression. If I switch over to JPEG, for instance, I get some different choices. I can still do my scaling and my sizing and my color space, but with this, JPEGs are all 8-bit, but I can control the compression of how much I want to compress my image for size. So I have all of this flexibility, and then I would just hit save, and it would create a nice JPEG that I can then upload to Facebook in this case, or to send off to my friends showing what an amazing photographer I am, when in reality, I'm just really good at processing pictures, or my shortcuts are really nice. So that's the idea behind working with multiple images. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close this out. And I'm going to work with a single image. And just to show you how it works really well with a single image. And one thing I love about Aurora is that, I think it's called Aurora HDR for high dynamic range, but I also think of it for extended dynamic range. So I can get the most out of an image. So for instance, I have this image here, which is what we started with. And I will go ahead, and as you can see, this is the raw out of the camera. The buildings are kind of dark, the sky, there's not a lot of detail. So I'm going to take a single image, drop it onto my Aurora HDR. It's going to give me some similar options to process it. You'll notice that it doesn't have an alignment issue because it's only a single image, so I don't need to align it. But if I go to the drop-down, I can do color denoise, which I will do because there's a lot of shadows, and I could do chromatic aberration. Ghosting is not available because ghosting only happens when you blend multiple images. So I'm going to go ahead. I just simply dropped it on. I'm going to say Create HDR, and it's going to analyze this single image, pull out as much detail as it can in the shadows and in the highlights. So it'll really do some great work with toning the image and improving the colors. And then it's going to give me its best analysis of an image to start with. And as you can see, this is pretty dramatic. Just by dropping a single image on here, I went from this to this, and now I can start processing my image. So this is a situation where we're going to actually start from scratch, and we're going to work with some of our sliders and not necessarily jump to one of these looks here. So a lot of times what I like to do is just process an image just so it looks nice and neutral. So I'm going to go with that smart toning to open up some details in the building. I'm going to add a little bit of vibrance to bring out some of the sky. Okay. If I wanted to do some color balancing, I have an eyedropper where I could choose something that would be neutrally white. I believe this ship was fairly white. So now you see it's actually balanced, gotten rid of some of the blue. I could go ahead and work my sliders also if I wanted to. Maybe just bring this up a little bit, make it a little bit more like sunset. And as you can see now, I went from this to this. And all I've done is actually worked with this HDR basic and just brought this up a little more detail. Let's go ahead and neutralize. So I'm bringing my saturation down, but my vibrance up. So it's nice and equal. And then I can just pop in some clarity. And then I have the image kind of where I want it to be. I could do a lot more work. I could add a vignette. One of the tricks I like to do with a toning curve is create something called an S curve, where I just click on this little point here and I make a little, bring up my highlights a little bit, but keep my shadows nice and deep. It looks a little bit like an S. So sometimes this really kind of makes your image pop a little bit more. A little goes a long way. And just to show you, the other thing that I really do love about Aurora is it can be as simple as you want it to be with, clicking on our looks and just making some adjustments. But if you're really looking to do some, delicate, detailed work, you have the power of that, HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. And I could literally go in and say, you know something, this red is distracting. So I'm going to just desaturate anything that's red. And you'll notice that it really only works in that one little color range. Okay, so I can bring that down and I can work with changing the hue of the red. I can make the red a slightly more orange color by bringing it to the right. So these just show you some of that fine control you have here on working on an image. So I get the image kind of where I like it. And then what I can do is add an adjustment layer. And this is generally how I do work. And now I can start playing with looks. So I have the basic image. I'm not going to change anything. Everything on my first layer is kind of semi-set in stone. And I could go and I could take advantage of some of these looks that we have. I'm going to bring in maybe our dramatic look. And you'll see these have changed. And I could just sit here and go through and click on these and stylize them to really create something I like. And I like some of these. I like this sleepy drama. I think it's too much, but I like this feel here to start. There it is with, there it is without. And if I wanted to, I could have it work with the sky, but maybe I want to go in and click on that little adjustment brush, and I'm going to erase it from the buildings. And this is similar to what I did before. And I'll keep my opacity down. And I can just go here, and I'm just taking some of that darkness out of the buildings. And I'm doing it very quick, but I want you to see this is what it looks like. It's kind of, I'm just pulling it out a little bit here. There we go. And I switch back and forth with that on and off. But here's the nice thing. This is the effect before, and this is the effect after. So really, it's only affecting the sky and the buildings a little bit. And this was my before image that I just took out of the camera, and how very quickly I got to something that has a much more drama. And again, I can save that, file, save. This is a single image. You'll notice that the document size is not very big. And I would go ahead, if I want this to be Windows compatible, I can go ahead and do that. Simply hit save. And now when I open this up, I would see all of the history if I wanted to go back and see how I did something. And here's a nice little trick. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Let's say, and I have my Aurora files here on my desktop. If I wanted to go back and work with some of these, as a matter of fact, if I actually look at my desktop this way, we can see the actual Aurora files. We'll do it by kind. There we go, our documents. So there is, say I wanted to work on that Brazil image again. So I want to tweak it, but I like what I did before. So what I would sometimes do is I would just simply duplicate that. I will just Option drag, makes a duplicate, and now I can open up that duplicate, modify the duplicate exactly how I want, and I still have the original. But you'll notice when I open up this duplicate, I will still have that whole history, and I can go back in time and start working on that. So that's a general overview of some techniques that you can use with Aurora. While this is opening, I will open it up for questions. So Laurie, are there questions that people are asking?
Yes, we do have a couple questions. One is by a gentleman who's asking, he's got both Aurora and Luminar. Can you explain why you would use one over the other and then even using them together?
Oh, that's an awesome question. And they really work well in concert with each other. One of the things I often do, especially now with this new HDR engine in Aurora, is I will start with a single image, if that's all I have, in Aurora, and just use it to pull out the dynamic range and the detail of my shot. And it has a much better, I say a more exacting engine. So here's the difference. If I open up an image in Luminar, it'll open up faster and I can start working with my individual sliders. If I open it up in Aurora, it may take about another 15 or 20 seconds because it's doing more calculations, and I get a more detailed image to start with. And then I can take that image and at that point immediately send it over to Luminar and take advantage of many of Luminar's features, such as the sky enhanced feature. We have Accent AI, which is our artificial intelligence for fixing images. There's sunset and sun rays filters. So there's a lot of filters that aren't available within Aurora that are within Luminar that I like to use when processing a picture. And on the flip side, what I like to do in Aurora is really work with my details, and it's very much a precision tool where I can actually work with microstructure and work with that smart HDR enhance. So they work really well together. And the workflow I like is to, if I'm going to work with them together, is I open it in Aurora first, whether it's a single or bracketed image. And at that point, I can either process it a little bit or a lot, and then send it to Luminar directly. Or sometimes I'll save it as a TIFF file and then open that TIFF file up in Luminar, depending if I want to kind of maintain that interim step. I do want to point out one of the things that's really great about Aurora. If you look in the far upper right-hand corner of my interface, you'll see it says 32-bit. And what that means is that the color depth that I'm working in Aurora is 2 to the 32nd for each of the colors. Now, this is the math thing. You don't have to worry about going back to your high school math, but most images are either 8 or 16-bit. So 2 to the 8th is millions of colors. 2 to the 16 is literally billions in colors. And then you go kind of beyond billions. And what that allows me to do by having so much color depth is really be able to work with nuance on my image. So when I export it as either an 8 or 16-bit file, it looks really, really good. So that's another beautiful thing about Aurora. So that's the workflow that I like. Sometimes I will never leave Aurora. Sometimes I will never leave Luminar. But there's many times that I actually use it to quickly get the best exposure from an image in Aurora and then jump over to Luminar to use some of the unique artificial intelligence and image-aware filters that are available there.
Perfect. Very good. Abba, while you're there, can you go under the color section on the panel on the right-hand side? You had explained saturation and vibrance, but we got a question about color contrast.
Color contrast. Yeah, sure. That works with the color midtones. And on some images, and I think it's not really pushing it here, I might want to open a new image. It actually works with the mid range of colors, and it makes the image feel a little more pop. So you're working with the contrast of the mid-range colors. So I think I've done enough processing that it may not show off here, but what I'll do is I'm going to bring this to the extreme, and then we can turn it on and off. And you can see it there in the mid-ranges of the blues. You'll see some nuances as this is off, this is on. So depending on the image, it works a little differently, but it's something that I generally add a little subtlety to. I think too much color contrast is distracting, but sometimes it just pops and punches the image a little bit more.
Okay, great. And Abba, do you mind opening up like 5 different bracketed images together? There was a question about deleting some of those as you're opening them
Oh,
up in
absolutely.
Aurora.
But let's go ahead and we will open these 5 images, and I should be able to delete one of these. Okay, so let's say I have these 5 and one of them was not needed. You'll notice as I hover over any of these, a little small X will appear. And if I choose that I don't want to use that as part of my bracket, I can simply click on that and it will only use the remaining 4 images. So that's how I would work with that. I'm going to hit cancel because the other thing you can do in this folder, there were actually 3 folders and each of them had 3 brackets. If I go to batch processing and I drag that onto my batch processing, it will analyze these images and you can see that it has grouped these into the brackets. In these cases, I can actually go ahead. I have the same option of hitting an X if I don't want to use one of the images. I can remove it. And I can also delete an entire group. So it will do the analysis and work with the brackets. The other thing I can do is if I choose to, I can say, I don't want to work with these as brackets. These are all individual images. And now it'll process, I can batch process these as individual images. And since I'm in this mode, I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. And what you can see here is when you do batch, you can go ahead and you can apply any of the looks that are available. So if you have a look that you like and how much you want it to affect the image, you can rename your files and then have it export them in all the same formats that we discussed earlier, TIFF, JPEGs, Photoshop, whatnot, and do resizing. So the batch processing is really nice. If you go into the advanced area, these are grayed out because we're not doing these as brackets. I'm doing them as individuals, but if they were brackets, I could even do a lot of these selections about alignment, ghost reduction, and whatnot. So that's one of the nice things. I'm not going to go ahead and do that, but I am going to show you one other thing that I really do like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use an image with a person just to show you an example. Here's a shot where she's underexposed and the sky's overexposed. This would be an instance where I might go ahead and start in Aurora and then take into Luminar. So I'll say create an HDR, and what it's going to do is pull out all that detail. But I want to point out something about looks and presets. Let me bring this full screen. You'll notice, first of all, that it already made this image pop, and I could go ahead and start working on some of the details and even brightening up her face a little bit or sending it over. But let's say I go ahead and I do fix this and I like the saturation, vibrance, and I've shot a series of images of her with this sunset, and I'm going to go back and take advantage of that. Red just pops so much. But let's say I like this and I'm going to add a vignette, and I'm working a little fast and furious here, but I want you to see something. So I'm going to add a little bit of a vignette just to pull her out. So that's my before, that's my after. And I love this look of processing my image. As a matter of fact, I may even bring down some of my highlights with smart turning. So as I fly through here, okay, we'll bring out some of those highlights. So I like that what it's doing. It's a good start. And I can go ahead in the bottom right-hand corner and I can save all of these adjustments as my own custom look. So I'm going to say Olivia Sunset, and I'm going to create a new look, and it actually puts that into my own personal collection of looks. So I have my user Aurora looks there, and there we go. I have that, and as a matter of fact, you can see here I made one for softer skin. So all I would do is I would add a new adjustment layer, apply softer skin, and then I could just go in and paint that exactly with my brush. And so the softer skin is just on her face, and I don't lose any of that other detail in the rest of the image. So by being able to make your own presets, you can very quickly process a series of images individually with nuances or batch process them. So there you go.
Very good. Okay, everyone, you should be able to see my screen. This is the Skylum website. Hopefully you can see that okay. So I was trying to answer as many questions as I could, and I threw a couple of questions over to Abba. So Abba, thank you for answering those. If there's some questions we didn't get to, I'm going to show you where you can find some of those answers. If you go to skylum.com, we have a plethora of information, education type things that I think that you'll find very helpful for both Luminar and for Aurora. Since we're talking about Aurora today, we're going to go to the Aurora HDR menu. There's a little drop down here. And if you want to get some more basic information, kind of more marketing information about HDR, Aurora, you can go ahead and click on one of these options here. And then over to the right, this is where we pretty much reside, is in the education section. There's a user guide, video gallery, and some FAQs. So if you go to education, you'll see that we've got a lot of different webinars and also some tutorials and videos that are here. We came out with a bunch of new video tutorials specifically for Aurora HDR 2019, so you may want to check those out. The other thing that might be of interest to you is to look at the user guide. And I really recommend that you take a look at the user guide, specifically if you have a question or you want to know how to do something. This is a very in-depth user guide that goes through every single filter, every single slider, and there's tips in here as well. So if you scroll down to the bottom here, you can actually download a PDF file format. This is a little bit easy to search. It combines both the Mac and the Windows versions together. So you might want to take a look at that. And then here's our video gallery. There's a bunch of videos in here. And for those of you who are just starting out, check out our quick start videos. This is to help you learn how to install on both Mac and Windows, installing as a plugin, etc. And then we have some more advanced features in here as well. So you can check those out. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Abba, I'm going to go ahead and let you say goodbye to everybody, but thanks everyone for watching with us.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. I hope you try out some of the techniques that I showed you. And there's a lot you can do with it and just have fun. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.